I know the opening session was very interesting and engaging, and this program is running a bit late. To colleagues who are joining us online, due apologies for that delay. And for you who are here, thank you so much for being here. Today, I'm going to spend about 25 minutes to run through our findings on this report on making Africa's capital work better for Africa's development. The presentation will cover the 3 chapters of the report. The first is on Africa's macroeconomic outlook in the short and medium terms. The second is on boosting effective domestic capital mobilization and efficient use. And the third is on the role of institutions and the rule of law for making Africa's capital work better for Africa's development. Then I will run through what is a toolbox of key actions that countries can take in order to make that happen for Africa. Straight into chapter 1, we can see that Africa's Please, can you put back the PowerPoint again? Thank you. We can see that Africa's growth has continued to remain resilient, even in the midst of all the challenges, the headwinds that global economies and African economies have faced in recent years, the most recent of it being the significant trade policy uncertainties that has emerged since the Liberation Day announcements of the United States. Because of that, we have revised down the growth performance, expected growth performance of countries in Africa. On average, our GDP growth is expected to now be 3.9% in the year 2025 and 4.0% in 2026, reflecting a 0.2 and 0.4 percentage point reductions, downgrades from what was estimated in our macroeconomic outlook reports in January because of the challenges that we're seeing, the uncertainties created by the trade tariffs that we've been talking about. And because of that, you also see that 21 African countries, even after taking into account the turbulence in the global economy, these 21 African countries will exceed about 5% of growth, GDP growth in 2024 and in 2025. And we see also that 5 African countries will grow by more than 7 percentage points in their GDP. And this is the point that we have already estimated will be required to break the vicious cycles of poverty on the continent. And 13 out of 20 African economies will remain among the 13 countries in Africa will be among the 20 fastest growing economies in the world. So from here, you can see that macroeconomic stabilization and policies that has been implemented by many African countries has continued to yield results. And for that, we really need to congratulate our African governments and institutions that support the continent, because we are seeing real impacts in the development of the continent. And one key measure we're always keen about is GDP per capita, because it's a very good way to track how poverty is going. On the left side of this slide, you will see that GDP per capita in Africa has continued to increase gradually from 0.7% in 2023, and also the negative 3.14% due to COVID in 2020. We've now risen to expect of 0.9% this year, in 2024, but expecting to get to 1.5 and 1.7% growth in GDP per capita growth in 2025 and 2026, respectively. And on the right side of the slide, you will see the performance with regard to actual impacts on people, reducing the poverty head count on the continent. Since 2014, we've seen the poverty head count on the continent go down significantly from 32.2% of the population to 31.2% 2.2% of the population when we had the COVID-19 pandemic hit the world. And because of COVID-19, as you recall, in 2020, we did report that over 30 million Africans were pulled back into poverty as COVID reversed over 1 decade of progress made in socioeconomic transformation on the continent. But even after that reversal, we have seen a very rapid return in terms of reductions, in terms of poverty head count on the continent, now at about 30.6%. This tells that macroeconomic policies that's going on in the continent is actually yielding results, even as our population continues to grow. Now, in the next slide, you are going to see that this performance that we are talking about is varied across countries and across different regional groupings in Africa, by geographic regions, but also by country groupings in terms of the structure of their economies, with Eastern Africa once again taking the lead amongst its peers because of significant diversification of their economies. The economy in the Eastern Africa region is estimated to grow by almost 6% by 2026, which is heading towards that 7 percentage point to have meaningful impacts on poverty reduction and job creation for youths in Africa. And all the other regions of the continent are also doing well, albeit gradually. East Africa is followed by West Africa. Then we have North Africa, Central Africa, and Southern Africa. And even Southern Africa, that we have recurrently reported as having challenges because of structural issues in South Africa, is now beginning to grow, despite the challenges we have seen with regard to the trade uncertainties and the trade tariffs. If you look at the economic groupings across the continent, then you find that non-resource intensive countries continue to maintain more than 5 percentage point growth since COVID-19. And you might remember that even during COVID, this was the economies in Africa that did not actually see significant recession. So again, something going on with how we relate with natural resources, which is one of the part of the themes of this these meetings on making Africa's capital work better for Africa's development. But the significant challenges in our macroeconomic fundamentals continue to remain, but even there, we see a mixed picture. Several countries have recorded significant progress, and on average, inflation, which reached 18.7% in 2024, is now heading downwards. So we predict 13.7%, 13.8% in 2025, and going down to below the double digits in terms of getting inflation down to 0.9% in 2026. And when you look at exchange rate dynamics, you find exactly the same issues, where we see that despite the challenges of exchange rate hiking and currency depreciation in 2024, in 2025 and 2026, we expect 21 African countries to see depreciation continuing, albeit more gradually, but appreciation in economies, in currencies for about 25 African countries as well. So again, even in the macroeconomic dynamics in Africa, we are seeing some significant changes. But again, debt and the debt dynamics in Africa continue to remain a policy concern. But when you look deep, it is not because Africa is borrowing more. It is because of the structure of the African debt. It's also because of transparency and accountability, and also the capacity of countries to be able to manage debt for growth in terms of focusing on debt productivity, not debt for refinancing debt, which is now happening a lot on the continent. But one point I want to raise is the issue around the cost of capital on the continent. This is a subject we have always raised in our AEO reports. And when you look in the structure of Africa's debt, you see that one of the drivers is the changing the structure of the debt more to commercial creditors. We now see that debt refinancing in Africa, which will this year cost Africa about $89 billion just to refinance, debt to service existing debt. 53% of that is for private creditors, because private credit, private loans are always shorter terms, higher interest rates, often more opaque than if you are borrowing from the Paris Club Group and also MDBs. And our estimates actually do show that African countries are paying 500%, and I hope it sinks, 500% more in interest rates when they are borrowing from private creditors, from commercial creditors, than when they are borrowing from multilateral development banks, such as the African Development Bank or the World Bank, and so on. And this already tells us that for us to make debt work for growth in Africa, there needs to be a stronger African Development Bank, a stronger African Development Fund, a stronger African Development financial institutions that will help to mobilize concessional resources, low-cost resources, but longer-term loans that can be used for doing longer-term development planning and implementation over the long run. And this next point we have there is that external service for debt is crowding out fiscal resources from the usual governance of countries to deliver on education, to deliver on health, and deliver on all those. That black line there is the rapid rise in the cost of debt, which is because of the changing structure of debt, but also the risk perceptions that we have always talked about in Africa's debt composition. Now, when you look at this slide, we have seen this before in 2024. On the left side there, we see what we call the paradox in Africa's cost of debt, because Africa has been demonstrably seen as the least defaulting in long-term infrastructure financed projects over a long time of period that Moody's Analytics have tried to look into, at 1.9% default rate compared to 12.4% in East Asia. And even in developed countries, we have 6.6% in North America and 4.6% in Asia. But Africa still pays higher premiums for accessing capital. And again, this is not unique to Africa, because when you dig deeper, you'll find that what is driving it is poverty. And on the right side of that slide, you see a perfect correlation between sovereign ratings by Moody's Analytics and GDP per capita growth, which means that the less your GDP per capita, the higher the risk of being downgraded by Moody's and the big three. And the more your ratings gets poorer, the higher the cost of capital. So again, that's a challenge that we need to continue to watch. And that is why in one of our recommendations, we are pushing very strongly for the reform of how risk ratings are done, because if we can't continue to discredit the poorer countries where the returns, the risk-adjusted margins for investments is proven to be much higher for the world and for all the investors themselves. But amidst that, we are seeing a more worrying challenge that concessional financing and access to grants that helps many African countries to be able to do development is dwindling. Despite the rebound in external financial flows we saw in 2023 because of portfolio flows that went from negative to positive, even in 2023, we already saw that FDI declined by 3.4%, ODA by 3%, and diaspora remittances by 6.2%. So, and recent announcements we are seeing from major ODA providing countries is projected to take away about $4.2 billion in US dollars for aid for growth in development in Africa. So again, many people argue that the age of aid is over. The age of cheap money is over. And that is why the African Development Bank Group focused on this theme of making Africa's capital work better for Africa's development. The time has come for the continent to look inwards and harness the rich assets that we have that has not been put to effective use. And on this particular slide, you can imagine we are paying more to access finance. We don't have enough in terms of fiscal capital, but if you look at fiscal financial flows out of the continent every year, we are losing more than 3 times the resources that Africa gets in terms of financial outflows. Here, just because of poor risk ratings that I've talked about, we lose about 74 billion US dollars. Illicit financial flows, the continent loses about 90 billion US dollars. Corruption costs the continent 148 billion US dollars. And the international profit shifting, base erosion and profit shifting is costing Africa about 275 billion US dollars. When you sum only that up, we have 587 billion US dollars leaving the shores of this continent every year. That is about 1.6 billion daily. But the continent add every form of international external flows into the continent. As at 2022, it was about around 190 billion. So if you do the math, Africa is actually a net creditor to the world. And it only takes better governance, rule of law, greater efficiency and accountability to hold these resources within the continent and channel it to better use. And the agency to do that lies within the continent. And then even for the resources that we borrow from loans and other things to do infrastructure, Africa has a 39% infrastructure financing gap, inefficiency gap, which simply means that we mobilize if we mobilize 100 billion for infrastructure in every year, 39 billion is gone due to inefficiency. And actually, looking at the actual figures of infrastructure financing in Africa, our estimates is that finance inefficiency in financing infrastructure on project selection, project preparation, portfolio management, procurement, and other things costs Africa about 106 billion US dollars every year. Again, the agency to hold this capital, to retain this capital on the continent and use it for development is within our reach. The IT people, this is not working very well. Can you please make sure it works? Then, if you look at all this, we can think about the potential downside risks that is within Africa's macroeconomic sphere. Persistent inflation is still ongoing, it's going down, the direction of travel is good, but we are not yet, it's not uhuru yet. Now we have high interest rate and the cost of capital, as I've talked about, debt servicing, debt refinancing remain a recurrent challenge for the continent. And then commodity dependence and price volatility in the commodity markets is another challenge that has continued to be a problem for the continent. And then needless to talk about climate shocks and the recent trade tariffs and policy uncertainties that we are seeing. All these are headwinds that policymakers need to continue to keep in mind as we move forward. And then leads us to the second chapter of the report, which is on how we can boost domestic capital mobilization and efficient use in Africa. How can we be able to mobilize domestic resources in order to be able to do development more on the continent? And here we took a pause to define capital in a more broader term, in the real sense of it, that capital is not just money. Capital includes human capital. Africa has a lot of it. Natural capital. Africa has a lot of it. Fiscal capital, financial capital, but also business capital. But if you look on the right side of that, how you combine all these forms of capital together leads to how you produce goods and services to grow your economies and improve the quality of lives for citizens in countries. So bringing all this together is what we call inclusive growth. But the challenge is our focused quite a lot on finance. Great inefficiencies because of fiscal profligacy in Africa and how we use fiscal resources. Great inefficiencies in how we use natural capital because of high discount rates that forces countries to sell commodities instead of add value to it. Great inefficiencies in how we use our human capital because of poor governance and rule of law on the continent that costs the Japa syndrome, if I speak the Nigerian language. That just means migration. So we have lots of Africa's capital migrating annually to contribute to development elsewhere for reasons that we in Africa can control. And then if you go forward, just keep this combining different types of assets that we have on the continent in your mind as we go through the presentation. So why are we not able to combine that effectively? State capacity and external factors is what we found drives low domestic capital mobilization, retention, and efficient use on the continent. You look at it from every lens, you see that government revenue in Africa is comparing very poorly to all the other regions at 19.8% of GDP. But the point I need to make is that African countries use 80%, basically 80% of total public expenditure in Africa is from this 19.8%. And that is why the scale of development is not yet being able to break the vicious cycles of poverty. But Africa is not as dependent as we always used to think. Find that we have a lot of headroom in our revenue mobilization on the continent. But to give an olive branch, the hope we find is that when you look at the right figure there, you'll find that there are countries in Africa who already understand how to do this and are even exceeding their peers in other regions. Countries like Lesotho, South Africa, Morocco, and many other countries are performing at par with regard to revenue mobilization. And we also see that when you invest in revenue mobilization in Africa, you see rapid results. And that is what we have seen in Cote d'Ivoire, in different countries where the African Development Bank Group has invested in terms of helping in the revenue mobilization on the continent. Several examples are there to show that it is possible. It's not rocket science. Then, second point here is that weak tax administration capacity in Africa is also leading to underperformance in tax collection on the continent. And you see on that right side of the graph, Africa is just about 14.8 as at 2023, 14.8% of GDP, compared to 32.9% in Europe and Central Asia. And even Africa itself has a tax capacity of about 20%. So we still have a lot of headroom to do better in collecting revenue without increasing tax rates on the continent. It's just about efficiency in administration of revenue collection. And you will see some recommendations on how to deal with that. On the right side is again to show that Africa is not one country. And several countries in Africa are doing very well with regard to tax collection as well, telling me that we have lessons, examples to learn from within the continent that to make it easy for us. So it, again, is not rocket science. Non-tax revenue collection in Africa is also the same. On average, we have about 5.3% of GDP in non-tax revenue collection in Africa, compared to a world average of about 7.1%. But if you look into the data, you will find that Europe and Central Asia is about 14.6%, and Africa is just at about 5%. Huge headroom to be able to do better. Again, on that graph on the left side, you find that some African countries provide case studies on how to do this better. What about business capital? Everybody talks about mobilizing the private sector. But again, I see a lot of private sector entrepreneurs and gurus in the sector in this room. But again, they will tell you, even though they are large on the continent, Africa's private sector in terms of scale still remains small. And if you look at the number of 1 billion plus companies in Africa, we have just about 345 compared to 1,500 in China. So we still have a long headroom in order to be able to deliver more in that area. But one other debilitating factor is that Africa still invests very little in research and development at 0.4% on average, compared to 2% and more in countries where they provide the ecosystem that allows for innovation and entrepreneurship to thrive. If you look on that right side there, you also see that we have huge informality on the continent. About 85% of businesses in Africa operate in the informal sector. most of it non-taxed. Why? There's reasons why informality is thriving on the continent because of the nature and type of private capital that is being mobilized on the continent. If we did well in bringing in this private sector, providing an ecosystem for SMEs to thrive on the continent, we can mobilize about 125 billion US dollars annually. These are much more than the resources that we focus a lot on to try and mobilize externally. There is money in Africa. It is about mobilizing and valorizing it. So in general, we find in our report that if we focused on simply improving efficiency, quality of institutions, transparency and accountability, macroeconomic policy governance, and all the recommendations that we always continue to talk about on the continent, this continent can mobilize 1.43 trillion US dollars every year without increasing tax rate. These are just headrooms that we have in existing policies and institutions that, avenues for mobilizing resources on the continent. And that is much more than we need to achieve the SDGs, which is 1.3 trillion. So if we go forward, when you get the report, you will see where each source of that 1.4 trillion is coming from. This is not rocket science. It's simply looking closer on what we have in order to use what we have to get what we want. And that led us, since we are finding out that institutions, quality, rule of law, transparency, accountability are the issues, is it just hearsay? Let's look at the correlations and the relationships on how quality of institutions, economic governance, and rule of law impacts on revenue mobilization in Africa, but also globally. If you look at the graph here, we'll find that the governance indicators, in terms of using Mo Ibrahim governance indicators in Africa, has been improving quite a lot, except in in issues around political instability and absence of violence. On all the other indicators, whether you look at the PEFA reports or the Mo Ibrahim reports, every report that is tracking the quality of institutions in the world, Africa has done well in the past 10 years, but we're not doing well enough when we compare ourselves with the rest of the world, which is the slide on the right side there. A lot of work needs to be done there. Why is this happening? So the key drivers and consequences of weak governance in Africa are huge. And if we understand where the rain starts beating us, then we can know when to get an umbrella. And this is why we looked at this, and you find that capacity constraints, capacity in mobilizing natural capital, in mobilizing domestic capital, fiscal capital, and all forms of capital is at the roots of the inefficiencies we have in institutions. When you don't have the money, you cannot set the systems to build the right institutions, to mobilize more resources, but also make the resources that you mobilized more efficient. But corruption has almost equal, if not more, impact than lack of financing in terms of the nature and quality of our institutions. Corruption in public service delivery, corruption in the public sector, but also corruption in how external parties relate with Africa. But other issues there is political instability and political interference in governance systems. That's independence or non-independence of different units of government, high levels of informality we've talked about, historical legacies and part dependencies where we are not negotiating the right contracts because of history and historical legacies. Some call it colonial history. Then also weak leadership in terms of who simply is leading the organization or leading the country. And all these lead to state capture. And because of state capture, we have lack of public trust among citizens, so they don't pay taxes. We have low tax and non-tax revenue because of poor, weak administration capacity, and we have fiscal profligacy and poor public financial management. We have high risk perception and cost of capital not because of perception alone, but also because of real challenges in the governance and stability of economies, but we also have base erosion and profit shifting by international and corporate organizations, abuse of power and illicit financial flows, and corruption. You notice that corruption is on both sides because it drives weak institutions and it creates weak institutions. Now, if you try to go deeper in terms of efficiency in tax mobilization, you will find, again, please, can you put back this slide? So you will find that governance quality has very direct implication on efficiency of resource mobilization, whether it's domestic or external. So when we talk about dwindling aid, dwindling FDI, dwindling remittances and portfolio flows, governance quality of countries we see is very directly related with it. The better governance you create, the more capital flows to your country. Transparency, accountability, control of corruption, property rights, and rules-based governance also have very direct implications on domestic and foreign revenue mobilization, especially in tax and non-tax collection. And because of this, it is only simply because when you have all these qualities, you create market stability, political stability that allows countries to, investors to believe in you and invest in your countries. So governance quality and tax revenue are very highly correlated. So if you improve effectiveness and the quality of controlling corruption, you increase tax revenue. If you also but one thing we find as countries that have natural resource rents will have an inverse relationship with tax revenue. So more natural resource and focus on natural resource rents is actually a challenge for many African countries. So put together, state capacity, state capture is at the roots of poor mobilization and utilization of resources in Africa, because it creates the elites will now negotiate preferential laws and regulations, tax exemptions, privileges, and so on. This is what I call the neocolonialism effect. Then we have monopolistic and oligopolistic competition emerging that creates weak property rights and high political risks, and that crowds out SMEs, and they all go informal because they don't trust what is going on in the government. And then corruption, tax evasion, all these things is just a vicious cycle. And these are things that can be handled from within the continent. It's just the political will to try and do that. So we go to policy recommendations. Next, please. On policy recommendations, we find that for the short and medium term, macroeconomic policy management remains key. How do we coordinate fiscal and monetary policy in the continent? Fiscal prudence, governance, and institutional reforms remain key, and also preemptive debt restructuring and decoupling our mindsets from aid and debt from consumption to focus on debt productivity is a key aspect. But in the medium term, we need to deepen regional economic integration and trade. We also need to leverage the ACFTA. We already have the instrument. We need to implement local content and franchising policies to allow us to add more value to our resources, but also preferred procurement to create domestic demand in the continent, and also strategic partnerships that can mobilize development finance from our partners. Next, please. And domestic revenue mobilization and retention remains a major issue we need to focus on, and different aspects. If you go back on tax revenue, we have a clear toolbox of what countries need to do in order to mobilize more tax revenue, but also leverage the resources within the continent. On efficiency in productivity for natural and human capital, there are several things that we need to do, but focusing on natural capital accounting and upgrading our systems of national accounts alone can hugely increase GDP growth on the continent. We already released a report on this, but also we need natural resource ownership. Quite a lot of times we talk about resource potentials on the continent, but who owns those resources? Have we signed them away to foreign firms and, I don't need to go too much into that. But we need also to improve transparency and accountability in how we use our natural resources to become more accountable to citizens. On human capital, we need to scale up appropriate education, and our emphasis is on appropriate education that feeds into the needs of the businesses in those countries, the needs of government and productivity on the continent. But we need to focus a lot more on leveraging the diaspora. If I just spend 1 minute on this. Africa's diaspora rose from about 19 million in 1990 to 48 million in 2024. And we have seen that consistently, remittances is the most steady and counter-cyclical source of resources for many African countries. Estimated to rise to 283 billion by 2030. And if we have clear and well-crafted policies, it can immediately rise to 500 billion today. So how we relate with our diasporans is very critical in terms of how we are going to be able to move this forward. We need to deepen integration and strengthen financial institutions on the continent. On regional integration and economic integration, I won't talk so much about it because we have discussed that in last year. But we have the ACFTA, we have several instruments that we need to continue to leverage more and more in order to deepen integration on the continent. But we can't have integration when Africans can't move from one country to the other. We can't have integration when the cost of travel between the continent, you would prefer to go to London or go to the US. So we need to continue to invest in the high five sectors, in transport and regional corridors and so on and so forth. You get the report, you will see the details on key growth drivers on regional integration we need to invest in. But we also need to strengthen Africa's development finance institutions. You have already seen, if you're borrowing from the African Development Bank Group, you pay 500% less than if you are borrowing from the capital market. So it's not rocket science. A bigger African Development Bank Group, a bigger African Development Fund, a bigger Africa 50, and many of our African institutions will deliver more development to the continent. But we also need to establish the missing ones, like the Africa Financial Stability Mechanism or the African Monetary Institute, to help support the continent on debt refinancing, but also on price stability across the continent. Because when you look into the countries of the continent, a lot of these are already happening in some countries. It's just for us to learn from each other and scale it up. And that can happen. So next slide. And here is my final slide on what actually is like what the president calls changing the Intel inside, the software that drives all these things we are talking about. And that software change needs to happen in Africa, African leaders and African citizens, but also in African development partners. For African leaders and African citizens, we need to strengthen African unity. True African unity, where an African and factors of production can flow freely from one country to the other. We need to make sure that we have a stronger African Union that is able to bring political stability and one voice for Africa on global issues. We need to implement the ACFTA. We need also to drive Africa's sovereignty in natural resources, in economic sovereignty and other things. But above all, we also need to create demand for Africa's products by Africans in Africa. We can't expect SMEs to grow if our taste is to buy, what do they call it? Toothpick from China. If you don't buy African products, there is no way, it's not rocket science. African entrepreneurs will not thrive. But for the development partners, we need, again, the reform in mindset. That reform in mindset, changing the Intel insights, is about the global financial architecture. We dwelt on it last year. The global financial architecture we have today does not deliver capital to where capital is needed most, by African and developing countries, but also by investors in the developed countries. If resources are not going to where you have greater risk-adjusted rates of return. What kind of economics are we doing? So for both developed and developing countries, reforming the global financial architecture is very necessary on risk perception, on global taxation that allows that 275 billion to leave the shores of poor countries in Africa. We need climate finance that is simplified enough to ensure that climate financing flows to climate vulnerable countries. Please read our AEO. We can't achieve our global climate goals if we continue that way. Base erosion and profit shifting needs to stop, but we also need to continue to provide concessional financing because we see that only that can actually drive development for a longer term. I hear a lot of conversation of private sector coming to the rescue. Private sector does not come to do development. I'm sorry. Private sector comes for profit. And when private sector comes for profit, interest rates will continue to go higher, and African countries will remain locked in a debt conundrum. So we can't replace public resources with private resources in development. Both are important. But public resources should be used to leverage private sector more using de-risking instruments and several innovations that the African Development Bank and others have been leading. But we also need to move from an extractives for export agenda to a win-win agenda that delivers growth in countries that are natural resources rich, high profits to investors that come to invest in those resources, but also reduces the global carbon footprint of trade. What we have now of mining resources from Congo and taking it to China or US or anywhere else to produce is 3 times more in terms of the cost of production. But it also has huge carbon footprint in those products that we are going to produce and then send back to sell to Congo and many African countries. So achieving inclusive growth that drives global sustainability, reduces climate change, but delivers on what we all care about, poverty reduction, jobs for youths and women, and other things, is possible, but we need to change the intel inside. We need to work together to have a good handshake of equal and productive partnerships with the continent. I don't believe that aid leads to growth, but I don't believe that aid is not necessary for growth. It is. But it is how it is delivered and how it is utilized. So we need to work on cost of capital. This is central because the cost of even climate finance is crowding out fiscal sustainability on the continent. Countries borrow to do climate adaptation. And the cost of refinancing those debts crowds out investments in health, investments in education, investment in resilient infrastructure, and so on. We need to collectively work together to change the intel inside. Transparency and accountability is a buzzword in all these discussions. On debt, I sit in many discussions, it's about debtor transparency. What about creditor transparency? We need transparency on both sides if we are actually going to be able to drive better efficiency in how we move resources forward. Like base erosion and profit shifting, that is the largest leakage of resources on the continent. It can't happen from one side. We need cross-border capital flows that is more affordable, cheaper, and more transparent on both sides as well. But we also need global peace and security. We cannot continue fighting wars and expect development to happen. There cannot be development without peace. And when you look at African countries that have high resources and are not delivering on development, there is one form of conflict or other going on in those countries. Why is that the case? We need to continue to work together to make this happen, and it is possible. Let's work together to make Africa's capital work for Africa's development. It is good for Africa, and it is good for investors that invest in Africa. Thank you very much.
insightful and very rich presentation. I will not try to summarize it all, because it was indeed very rich and comprehensive, but maybe a few key points. Since we are living in a challenging context, it is critical that we implement sound and tailored macroeconomic policies in our countries. You've also mentioned the importance of better governance, accountability, and rule of law if we want to make Africa's capital work better for Africa's development. And an issue very close to my heart, you've mentioned harnessing diaspora for productive investment. Thank you very much. So now I would like to play the video, because we're supposed to start with that, and we had an IT issue. Please, can we play the opening video now?
Is changing. With global uncertainties, shifting aid priorities, and geopolitical tensions, the continent stands at a crossroads. Africa has what it takes to finance its own development agenda, using our own capital. Not by loans, not through aid, but with domestic resources. Africa currently finances 80% of its development locally. Now, what if the continent allocated its resources more effectively? It's time. Together, let's use homegrown resources combined with homegrown solutions to create the Africa we want. Welcome
to the launch of the Bank's 2025 African Economic Outlook Report on making Africa's capital work better for Africa's development, which is also the theme of the Bank's 2025 annual meetings.
Thank you very much. Yes, a warm round of applause. Thank you. And now I would like to call our Senior Vice President, Mrs. Marie-Laure Akin-Olu-Bade, Senior Vice President of the African Development Bank Group, to deliver the opening remarks on behalf of President Adesina.
Merci beaucoup, Linge. And good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of President Adesina, my role was to welcome you, but I see that you are all comfortably seated, and I hope duly challenged by the very insightful presentation by Professor Orama. And like you, I agree, nothing of this is rocket science. So let me go back to my script. Good afternoon, everyone. The African Economic Outlook Report is our opportunity to analyze and project economic growth trends for Africa, to assess the pace of structural transformation of countries, and to evaluate the effects of global dynamics on African economies. The African Economic Outlook Report 2025, you have seen it, shows that 21 African countries are projected to achieve real GDP growth rates of above 5%. And this is despite the challenging global context. And Africa accounts for 13 of the 20 fastest growing economies in the world. Clearly, better macroeconomic policies and stabilization efforts are really showing good results, and they are showing up the resilience of the countries, of the economies. And in the face of global dynamics of tariff, the debt, and the decline in official development assistance, it is absolutely imperative and urgent, more than ever, that Africa focuses more on domestic mobilization of resources. And this is why, as you have heard, the theme for the African Economic Outlook for 2025 is making Africa's capital work better for Africa's development. The report, you've seen it, and you will read it, report lays out a raft of areas for expanding the mobilization of capital in Africa. And let me just cite a few of those. Transitioning African businesses from the informal sector to the formal sector by simply simplifying business registration procedures and tax filing processes as well, we've seen it can generate $125 billion in new revenues annually. Similarly, securitizing remittances through diaspora bonds can equally mobilize about $30 billion annually. Improving the overall governance holds one of the best ways to generate revenue. Indeed, ending illicit capital flows will generate approximately $90 billion annually, and ending profit shifting by multinational corporations will add $275 billion annually in revenues and let Africa stop being a net exporter of capital, as Professor Urama told us. So ending corruption will add about $148 billion annually, and this represents 25% of Africa's GDP. This is huge. This is simply huge. And the proper valuation and inclusion of Africa's natural capital in the estimation of its GDP will expand the valuation of the economies, and it will add billions of dollars to the economies. For example, Africa's nominal GDP could have been $66 billion higher just from the carbon sequestration in 2022, and this is a potential output expansion of about 2%. But we live in very uncertain times, and the world has been shaken with the US tariff and the emerging tariff wars. And yes, it's probably muted temporarily, but we are still in the midst of very high uncertainties and shocks to the global economy. And in Africa, 47 out of 54 countries have been impacted by the US tariff. And the new 50% US tariff on the European Union will further exacerbate these trade uncertainties with very significant heightened downside risk to the global economies and to the African economies, the countries. And this trade policy shift will also have other effects, including, of course, a decline in concessional financing and official development assistance. Africa must diversify its export markets to reduce its vulnerabilities. African countries must therefore strengthen their capacities to negotiate on the emerging strong interest for its vast natural resources, especially critical minerals. Africa's interests must come first, and the newly refocused African Natural Resource and Investment Center of the African Development Bank and our African Legal Support Facility, as well as the African Mineral Development Center at the African Union Commission, will play critical roles in supporting Africa to raise more capital from its vast natural resources. In closing, let me say, on behalf of President Adesina, that in today's world, the only reliable ally you have is yourself. So Africa must look inwards, must unlock and mobilize domestic resources to reduce vulnerability and grow its economies with pride. The policy recommendations in the African Economic Outlook 2025 are very insightful, they are compelling, they are practical, and they are absolutely timely for Africa. And I would like to thank Professor Kevin Urama, the directors, and all the team members. May I please ask you to stand? All the ECVP complex, please stand, 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 and be recognized for the excellent work that you are all doing. Professor Urama, you and your team have and you've gotten us used to it year after year. You have really produced an excellent African economic outlook report, and the President and all of us are extremely proud of the quality of all our knowledge products. So thank you very much, and do enjoy the report.
Thank you so very much, SVP. Thank you. I will just retain this sentence. I think it was very powerful that in these times, the only reliable ally that you have is yourself. That reminds us that Africa must take full responsibility for its own development and future. Thank you for that. Now we're going to proceed to the unveiling of the report. We're going to have a digital unveiling and an in-person unveiling. And I would like to call Senior Vice President, Madame Marie-Laure Akin-Olugbade, on the stage. Professor Kevin Urama, Chief Economist and Vice President for Economic Governance and Knowledge Management of the African Development Bank Group. Executive Director Edmond Vega, Chairperson of the External Communications and the Preparation of the Bank Group annual meetings, and also the panelists to join us. Mr. Alain Ebobisse, CEO of the Africa 50 Group. Mr. Bolaji Balogun, CEO of the Chapel Hill Denham. Mr. Roger Stewart, Regional Representative of the EIB in Côte d'Ivoire. Mrs. Boitumelo Mosako, CEO of the Development Bank of Southern Africa, and Dr. Baba Moussa, Executive Director, West African Institute for Financial and Economic Management. Please give them a warm round of applause. And congratulations to the team and to the African Development Bank Group for this report. Thank you very much. Please, the panelists, you can stay on stage as we're going to start the next segment of this event, which is going to be the panel discussion. First of all, let me thank you all very much for accepting to be part of this panel discussion. I will maybe reintroduce you very quickly. We have with us today Mr. Alain Ebobisse, Chief Executive Officer of the Africa 50 Group. Mr. Bolaji Balogun, Chief Executive Officer of Chapel Hill Denham. Welcome. Mr. Roger Stewart, who is the Regional Representative of the European Investment Bank in Côte d'Ivoire. Mrs. Boitumelo Mosako, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Development Bank of Southern Africa. Welcome. And Dr. Baba Moussa, who is Executive Director of the West African Institute for Financial and Economic Management. Welcome to all of you, and thank you again for your presence. So to our distinguished panelists, I'm going to ask you very specific questions to hear your insights and also your hands-on experience in relation to some of the key issues that were discussed in the report. And I'm going to start with you, Mr. Alain Ebobisse.
Thank you.
And this question is about the importance of asset recycling. Asset recycling offers huge potential to help reduce Africa's infrastructure financing gap and lessen the continent's dependence on tied project aid. Yet, the use of asset recycling remains low on the continent. Given your institution's experience, how can we best engineer asset recycling to free up funds for critical infrastructure development on the continent?
Yeah, thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to express my gratitude to the African Development Bank for inviting me to speak on this panel. Hopefully my mic is working. And also, I like to say that I'm really extremely supportive of the theme for the Africa Economic Outlook, making African capital work better for African development, because it's extremely important. We are not going to achieve a sustainable development of the continent without having a substantial focus on mobilizing domestic and regional resources for Africa's development. Now, the good news for us is that there is a huge amount of resources that are managed by African institutional investors. According to the African Development Bank, I believe over $2 trillion of assets under management by African institutional investors. I think it's $2.4 trillion. And if we're able to figure out a way to channel some of those resources into funding African development, I think we're going to do quite a good job. Now, what do we need to do that? We need to offer the right product to those institutional investors so that they can feel comfortable investing in those products. So asset recycling is one such product where basically we are working with governments to look at commercial assets that have been financed by governments. Those commercial assets could be concessioned out to Africa 50 and others, and then the proceeds of the concession would be used to fund new assets. What we would then do, we will bring institutional investors from Africa and globally to invest in those recycled assets, and this is how we managed to really to put together the asset recycling program of Africa 50. Now, why is it that it hasn't been adopted widely? Just because it is a relative new instrument for the continent. It has been used in other continents, but in Africa, we started to promote asset recycling about 3 years ago. I like to mention and express my gratitude to President Adesina, because he was one of the key supporters of asset recycling. He supported us at Africa 50. We worked with the bank to do asset recycling work, and we completed our first transaction in recycling the Senegambia bridge. And the Minister of Finance of the Gambia is here. He's a very happy man because he received some money out of a bridge, and now he's one of the biggest promoters of asset recycling. Now, we're talking to a number of countries. Essentially, asset recycling is a way to manage the debt of government who have assets where the money is immobilized in the asset, as opposed to keeping the money in the asset. You can monetize that asset, but the proceeds of the recycling should then be reinvested in new assets. So my view is that as we continue to promote the successes of asset recycling, we're going to have a lot more adoption, and indeed the African Development Bank can also help continue to push that financing techniques, and we hope that it will be a bit more adopted.
Thank you very much, and thank you for being so concise. Thank you. And of course, I mean, we've addressed infrastructure financing through asset recycling, but I think it's also vital that we have a broader perspective when it comes to development financing. And then this leads me to my next question on African capital markets, and the question is for you, Mr. Balogun. Your investment management firm is a strong believer in the power of developing capital markets to fuel long-term economic growth. What are the key policy actions needed to overcome the fragmented nature of Africa's capital markets? And how can we ensure that within the continent, investors are able to trade, but also take advantage of investment in capital markets outside their primary jurisdictions?
Thank you very much. Firstly, thank you to the African Development Bank for inviting me here. I'd also like to thank Professor Rama and his team for an excellent African economic outlook, and in many senses, you've provided the segue into most of the points that I'll touch on. I'd like to slightly alter the question you've asked me and really focus on what are the 6 or 7 key things that we can do to make Africa's capital markets finance Africa's development. And I'd like to start by talking about how most of Africa's GDP is informal and most of Africa's savings are actually outside of the formal sector. The LSC just finished a study in the DRC which suggests that about 6 times, or the informal economy in the DRC is about 6 times the size of the formal. The order of magnitude across the rest of Africa could be very, very different. But I would imagine that in most countries, because what we describe, or what OECD economists describe as informal markets, actually is our own traditional paradigm of markets, and we should start thinking about them as formal. So the key is, how do we create products in our capital markets to bring all of that informal sector into the markets? Digital technology is a very, very strong, channel for doing so. And we've seen very significant businesses built across the continent in countries like Nigeria, in Kenya, which 7, 8 years ago didn't exist. Today manage hundreds of billions, in savings of young Africans, people who ordinarily we would think, are excluded or aren't even wealthy enough to have significant savings. Technology can be very important. We've also seen Africans be incredible adapters of cryptocurrency, and that suggests, that blockchain can be a really significant tool as we start thinking of how we bring informal capital into the formal capital markets. I think one of the other elements we need to think about is how we create capital for diaspora, product for diaspora. And too often the focus is on creating bonds, but we actually need to think about utilizing asset management platforms. Because across the world, there are very, very few examples of individuals handing over their money to governments to manage. What you will find is that individuals will give their money to well-governed asset management companies, typically investing in listed products in domestic markets. One of the ways to convert a lot of that fiscal and government capital which is trapped in is very simply getting every African country to begin to get its government agencies to get a rating and start using domestic capital markets. What it will bring about first and foremost is a huge shift in culture. It will bring about significant transparency. This is a big issue and a very significant, contributor to the low levels of capital formation that we see in most markets. I'll also talk about Africa's sovereign wealth funds as well as many of our large domestic pension funds. Too often, Africa's sovereign wealth funds are investing externally and building prosperity in other markets. We need to take a Singaporean strategy where GIC and Temasek were focused for more than 30 years primarily on building Singapore. Most of the countries in which we're investing our small billions of dollars have significantly well-developed capital markets. While I understand the diversification issue, the reality is that this continent needs a lot of that capital. Finally, if we develop Africa's natural capital and we fail to develop that capital in domestic capital markets, we would have made a tragic mistake. If all of our carbon resources, for example, were sold offshore and we didn't find a way of developing domestic carbon markets in Africa, trillions of dollars potentially would be lost, to this continent. The same way when you think about metals, commodities, I'll give you one final example. 3 of the 5 largest producers of cocoa in the world reside on this continent. why do we not trade cocoa in Africa's commodity markets, given the fact that we control 60–70%, right, of global resources? Imagine what that would do for the balance of trade and what it would do for balance of payments across the continent.
Thank you very much. I think this was very insightful. I don't have much to add to that. It was a good conclusion. So my next question goes to Mr. Roger Stewart. Your institution, the European Investment Bank, is one of the biggest multilateral financial institutions in the world, and also one of the largest providers when it comes to climate finance. So while MDBs have pledged 1.2 trillion USD in terms of climate finance by 2030, I would like to ask you, from your perspective, how can private and public sectors work together to close the remaining 4 trillion USD annual funding gap for climate finance by 2030? And what are the innovations that your institution have been implementing to attract private wealth and increase climate investments?
Thank you, and thank you to Professor Orma for a very interesting, I'm going to take it home and start reading this evening, start taking notes. Yeah, so we're, I would say climate finance is really the core, is very much in the core of what we and many other IFIs at this stage of human history are focused on. In 2021, we committed that by 2025, 50% of all of our lending activity would be based around climate. And we actually achieved that goal in 2023 and 2024. Last year, 50% of all of our lending, 88 billion we signed last year, was had a climate element to it. And 34% actually had an adaptation element as well. So it's very become part and parcel of what we do. Here in Sub-Saharan Africa, it was about 2 billion. So we focus on, we have to be sensitive to the political orientations of our partner countries, obviously, but also the European Union objectives. And in that regard, there's a Global Gateway Initiative, which is very much the flagship. So we support that, and one of the pillars of that is renewable energy. What does that mean? That means for us that everything we do kind of revolves around climate finance. And I think it goes to the professor's point about saying we providing inexpensive and affordable financing throughout Africa. We are one of the pieces of the toolbox, let's say. We're clearly not the we're not the be all and end all, but we are one aspect of the toolbox. So we ourselves have issued approximately 200 billion of green bonds ourselves since 2007 on the borrowing side, and then on the lending side, public sector and private sector. On the public sector side, we tend to support climate deals which are transformational and structural, i.e. Rehabilitation of hydroelectric projects or transmission lines between and across countries, or extension of electricity grids to rural sectors and supporting off-grid solar. Then in the private sector side, so on the banking side, more and more the lines of credit that we would extend to commercial banks or development finance institutions have very much a thematic, environmental, climate thematic to it. In that regard, I'd mention 200 million line of credit we extended to our friends with DBSA to support their embedded generational investment program, which is aiming to support 1,200 megawatts of solar energy in South Africa. I won't list them all, but so lines of credit with First Rand National Bank in South Africa, with Trade and Development Bank, with the ECOWAS EBID Bank of 100 million. We basically give a line of credit, inexpensive credit, to a counterparty, and then we require that those funds be on lent in the renewable energy space. Then we also provide, we invest in infrastructure funds, which then invest in, so there's the African Finance Corporation's Resilient Climate Fund. We gave them 52 million to invest in. And then finally PPPs, where we support project finance transactions in things like Nactigal or Kikot in Cameroon, or the IFC scaling solar. Now, that's kind of what we do. So we're, as I said, we're one piece of the toolbox, but what are kind of some things that we could, where's the innovation? I would talk about 3 examples. One is the Global Green Bond Initiative, where the idea is that we're in the process of constituting this. It's a €3 billion fund. 1 billion will be public sector money, so that's us and another like Agence Française de Développement and others, which are supported by a counter guarantee from the European Union. So there's going to be $1 billion of public sector money, and then that public sector money will act as a first loss piece within the fund, so that private sector, the alliances of this world, or wealth funds and such, will put their money in because they know they have the first loss piece. So that's you're attracting $2 billion of private capital, and then the fund will invest in bonds that are green, with the taxonomy and such, and those, but it will only invest 25%. It will only purchase 25% maximum of those bonds. So in other words, you have a kind of a public sector fund that is investing in green bonds, but then 75% of the green bonds, public and private sector green bonds, will be private sector. So that's one example. Then another thing that's mentioned, and I kind of always say, if they build it, they will come. So if there's a lot of money out there that that's interested in projects that are well structured, that are bankable, that have but it's very expensive, it's very difficult and challenging project preparation. It's a very common theme. And we were provided a grant by the German government of 20 million to, it's called Greening Finance Systems, and it's effectively what we're doing is supporting central banks and local banks in a certain number of jurisdictions to kind of integrate climate assessments in financial regulations from the central banks, creating green taxonomies so that green deals can be prepared, and then helping to build the pipelines of local banks. And then finally, I would say the last thing is kind of innovative structures. So your colleagues are mentioning the kind of expensive debt issue here on the continent, but elsewhere. And we last year with the IDB, we provided 150 million guarantee, IDB the same amount to Barbados, which then allowed them to issue a loan because it was backed by our AAA guarantee at a very inexpensive level, which then was used to retire more expensive debt. And then the savings that were generated, so it was 300 million, it generated savings 125 million, and a portion of that is then used to reinvest in projects which are sustainable. So those are some examples I would give. Now we are in Ivory Coast, so if I may, le père fondateur de la nation, Félix Houphouët-Boigny, he basically said, man has gone to the moon, but has not yet, cannot make a flame tree or a bird song. And so let us take care of our countries and try to ensure that we don't long or yearn for the bird song or the flame tree, le flamboyant, in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the anecdotes at the end. I think from your response and making the link, to the efforts to mobilize both private and public funds for climate, but for development in general, it is also important that we explore the role of regional cooperation and resource integration while we do so. And this really gives me the perfect transition to Mrs. Mosako. As a major development finance institution in Southern Africa, which is a region with many resource-intensive countries, what is your institution's view on developing regional resources value chains through cross-border industrial hubs? What strategies are you implementing to promote the use of natural resources across borders to boost regional industrial growth?
Firstly, I'd like to express my gratitude and appreciation to my brother, Professor Kevin, for the report that was launched today, and the insights into your team as well. You know, when I was reflecting on what you were saying, and the number that comes to mind is that that real GDP growth number that is just above 2% for Southern Africa, when Southern Africa is resource rich. And when you look at how the world is talking about critical minerals and having strategies for critical minerals, yet a bulk of those are actually sitting in the region. So we sit with a great opportunity to then say, how do we turn that 2-point-odd real GDP growth, triple it over the next few years, and what is it going to take? As a development finance institution within the region that focuses on infrastructure development, one of the decisions that we took as an institution was how we're going to enable the region taking advantage of critical minerals. We have developed our critical minerals strategy as an institution. And what is going to enable that strategy remains the back to basics. It's about energy security. So we have to ensure that as a region, we take advantage of the resources that we have in terms of gas, actually developing gas to power opportunities. We have to strengthen our transmission network in the region. Thirdly, we have to develop and strengthen the corridors. I mean, we are currently financing the Lubito corridor, another part of it together with the USDFC, and that is an investment that we are making. But in our decadal strategy, we are very clear on creating and developing corridors. One of the things that Kevin mentioned the professor mentioned in the report was issues around efficiency. How do we achieve efficiency? And we achieve efficiency by actually making sure that we deploy proper de-risking instruments. How to reduce that 39% that he then mentioned. In the creation of corridors, in the creation of strengthening transmission networks, in ensuring that there's sufficient water capacity in the region. What we have adopted to actually enhance these efficiency measures is a programmatic approach to investment. So it's not one-by-one investment, but actually creating a program for investment. And by that, there's a lot of examples that I can make within the South African context. We're currently developing one for transmission. We have a water one at the DBSA. We've recently developed one for the one border post, to actually enable regional integration, and we have 6 of those opportunities out on RFP. We've adopted the approach to say, when we standardize, we actually enable scale and also speed. And what that does as well, it actually also provides an enabling environment for private sector participation, but leveraging public sector funding. And these are the opportunities that we have, that we are implementing as an institution. And when when I was listening to, we have to be introspective as a region, and I'm of the view that all we need we have. All we have in the region to achieve the real GDP growth that we so desire. I mean, we are the fastest growing region globally, and we have to make sure that we get these basics right. The last point I'd like to make, and I want to link it to what Prof touched on governance and institutional strength. It's going to be important that as we embark on this journey, including taking advantage of these critical minerals opportunities, creating manufacturing capability in the region. We also strengthen the national development banks in the region. Institutional strength is going to be critical as part of that. It's clear governance attracts money, and we have to ensure that we work as a system, as multilateral development bank, with the AFDB, with the regional banks within the continent and in the region. That we work towards a system where we also strengthen the public development banks, so the national development banks in those countries, by actually, providing instruments in terms of technical support and capital as well. As an advocate for national development banks, I mean, we are a national development bank, but we do not only operate in South Africa, but we operate in sub-Saharan Africa. And as an institution that has strong governance, we have seen the benefits of having a strong governance system, because we have managed to mobilize funds globally. I mean, including mobilizing from institutional investors from, for instance, we did a transaction from the US, and the funds were provided in our own local currency. The last thing that I'd like to mention, that for us to also, embark on this journey, it's also going to be critical for the AFDB, the multilateral development banks, to actually make a commitment on providing local currency financing to the national development banks. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. I think it was very rich, and I really like the emphasis you put on, putting more importance to the local solutions and the local financial institutions, such as the national development banks, with a regional perspective. I think this is very important, and it's true for Southern Africa region, but for all other regions of Africa as well. Thank you for that. And my last question now goes to Dr. Baba Moussa. Africa holds sizable yet underutilized sovereign wealth funds and pension funds. The African Economic Report states that mobilizing just 1% of pension fund assets from Africa's 6 largest economies could yield $70 billion USD annually, offering great potential to finance development and grow financial markets. So how can Africa ensure that it is able to tap into this pool of institutional savings and scale up investments in bankable and profitable projects?
Thank you. Let me start by thanking Professor Rama Chika for this excellent presentation, and of course for touching so many of the things that we've been actually, discussing in Africa, and for bringing them out so eloquently in this presentation, and his team, of course. Regarding your question, I think the first thing that I believe we can do as Africa is to strengthen the enabling regulatory and policy environment. If we strengthen that, we need clear investment guidelines. Some of the regulators really need to come out or at least reform some of the outdated investment guidelines and rules that we have across African countries. If you look at the investment guidelines, governing sovereign wealth funds and pension administrators, most of them limit their investment to low yield investment in government funds. And if we reform that, that will allow the pension administrator or the pension funds and the sovereign wealth fund to actually have a leeway to invest more on infrastructure, on green bonds, and other development agenda. So we really need that to be, we need reform in the laws. Then also adopt what we call the risk-based supervision in terms of addressing these issues. We are currently, locked in what we call the rigid asset allocation rules. That's what guides most of the investments in pension industry and the sovereign wealth fund. We need to adopt the risk-based framework as we see in the OECD countries. That really gives the sovereign wealth fund opportunity to actually, invest in a proper investments that can bring development into the region. Secondly, I think we also need to enhance the bankability of the project. Clearly, as Professor Chika pointed out in the report, weak project preparation is a key barrier to development. And with DFI's development finance institutions and government in Africa really need to scale up the PPF to at least support feasibility studies, let them support also financial modeling that will really provide the sovereign wealth fund opportunities to invest. And finally, also, let's also adopt what we call the revenue guarantee and the risking instruments in our model of operations. By this, I mean that we should try to introduce instruments that gives minimum guarantees, introduce what we call political risk insurance, another form of insurance that will help lower passive risk and crowd in capital in our investment. I also thirdly want to advise that one way forward is to create a dedicated infrastructure investment vehicles in our countries. If we have national infrastructure funds, this can act as intermediaries between pension and sovereign wealth funds and then projects that are offering professional investment management, due diligence, and pipeline developments. If we have those kind of projects, I think that will also help. Additionally, we can also, have a regional pool of funds. That actually has been highlighted in the report. Pooling assets across countries via, let's say, African Union, the ECOWAS or SADC, and another regional economic community can really overcome the challenges of small and fragmented markets that we've been experiencing in Africa. And to also quote the 2025 report, we need to improve transparency, governance, and build capacity of our fund managers. That will really help. We need to also finally promote policy alignment with political commitments. What I mean is that national development plans need to be anchored or align fund investment with national and regional development priorities. That will give legitimacy to some of the projects. And then also, let's involve our heads of state, the ministers of finance, the governors of central banks, to involve on high-level political advocacy for domestic resource mobilization. I think if they give that as a priority, that will help. So to summarize the 2025 report that was presented, for me, I summarize it this way. Tapping into African sovereign wealth and pension fund is not merely financing question. It is a strategic imperative for structural transformation, resilience, and self-reliance. So with the right policy architecture, risk mitigation tools, and investment vehicles, Africa can channel its own institutional savings into productive, high-impact investment. This will not only reduce reliance on volatile external capital, but also deepen financial markets and stimulate inclusive growth in Africa. That's my summary of the 2025.
Thank you so much for this response and for the summary. I really wanted to continue this conversation because this has been fascinating, and I'm having the feeling that we were just touching on those, it's the start of a conversation, I would say. I only wish we had more time to continue this discussion, but I am sure we will have other opportunities to do so. Maybe before we conclude, allow me to quickly summarize in few points the main key takeaways from this discussion. So first, asset recycling can be a very important tool, a way to manage debt. However, we will need to scale up its use across the continent. Second, developing Africa's capitals means also developing Africa's capital markets. Third, while we leverage both private and public sectors, we need to have a mix of instruments for climate finance. And fourth, we have to take advantage of the resources that we have and implement the right policies to be able to make Africa's capital work for its development. And the regional perspective will be very important here, but this regional perspective would be based upon the local solutions, such as the National Development Bank. So local financial institutions have to be part of the solution. And fifth, we need to enhance the regulatory environment to both tap into the resources from sovereign wealth funds and pension funds. And again, Mr. Musa, you've highlighted the importance of having a regional approach while we do that. So with these words, I would like to really thank our distinguished panelists for their excellent and truthful contribution. Please give them a round of applause. Thank you so much. And I would like to thank you, really. It has been a pleasure and an honor for me to be part of this event, and we can take a group picture. I wish you all a productive rest of the day. Thank you. Thank you.